For over a century, one name defined American aviation. That name was Boeing. It stood for more than just airplanes. It represented a promise of safety, a spirit of innovation, and the power of American industry. Boeing was not just a company, it was a national icon. Its planes connected cities and continents. They carried presidents, soldiers, and families. When you stepped onto a Boeing jet, you felt a sense of pride and confidence. This was the gold standard of air travel. The company built machines that seemed to defy gravity with grace and reliability, making the world feel smaller and more accessible for everyone who dared to dream of the skies. The company's story began in a humble boathouse in Seattle. William Boeing, a timber magnate, saw the future in the air. He founded the company in 1916. From its earliest days, Boeing was driven by a passion for engineering. It was a place where designers and builders were kings. They were given the freedom to create the best possible aircraft. This philosophy guided the company for decades. It led to some of the most legendary planes in history. The focus was always on quality and safety, above all else. This commitment created a deep-seated trust with airlines and the flying public, a bond that seemed unbreakable and built on decades of proven performance. Boeing's reputation soared to new heights with each new aircraft it produced. The company was responsible for military giants like the B-17 Flying Fortress, which helped win World War II. It also created commercial legends. The Boeing 707 ushered in the jet age, forever changing how people traveled. Then came the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies. This massive, graceful jet made international travel affordable for the masses. It was an engineering marvel and a symbol of American ambition. For many people, the silhouette of a 747 against the clouds was the very image of modern flight, a testament to what human ingenuity could achieve. This legacy was built on a simple but powerful idea. The engineers, not the executives, were in charge. They made the final decisions. Their primary goal was to build the safest, most reliable planes in the world. Profit was important, of course, but it was seen as a result of engineering excellence, not the main driver. This culture permeated every level of the company. It created an environment where employees felt a deep sense of responsibility. They were not just building machines, they were safeguarding lives. This core value was the bedrock upon which Boeing's empire was constructed, earning it the respect of the entire world. Boeing's history is a timeline of aviation firsts. The company consistently pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. In the 1930s, the Boeing 247 revolutionized air travel. It was the first truly modern airliner, an all-metal monoplane that was faster and safer than anything before it. This aircraft set the standard for commercial aviation design for years to come. It showed the world that flying could be comfortable and efficient. Every new model that rolled out of Boeing's factories seemed to be a leap forward, not just an incremental improvement. This relentless drive to innovate was what kept Boeing at the forefront of the industry for so long. The post-war era saw Boeing solidify its dominance. The company leveraged its military experience to create groundbreaking commercial jets. The Boeing 707 was a game-changer. It was fast, sleek, and could cross oceans with ease. Airlines rushed to buy it, and passengers loved it. The jet age had arrived, and Boeing was its leader. Then, in 1969, the company unveiled its masterpiece, the Boeing 747. It was twice the size of any other commercial plane. Its iconic hump and massive wingspan were instantly recognizable. The 747 was more than an airplane. It was a cultural phenomenon and a testament to bold engineering. This spirit of innovation was not limited to building bigger and faster planes. Boeing was also a leader in safety technology. Its engineers developed advanced navigation systems, stronger materials, and more reliable engines. The company invested heavily in research and development. It operated massive wind tunnels and testing facilities to ensure every design was as safe as possible. Pilots trusted Boeing planes because they were built to handle the unexpected. They had redundant systems and were known for their robust construction. This reputation for safety was earned over millions of flight hours without a single major incident for many of its models. The result of this dedication was a brand that was synonymous with trust. For generations of travelers, the name Boeing on the side of a plane was a guarantee. It meant you were flying on the best-built aircraft in the world. Airlines chose Boeing because their planes were reliable and efficient, keeping schedules and costs in check. Pilots preferred them for their handling and safety features. This deep well of trust was Boeing's most valuable asset. It was built slowly, plane by plane, flight by flight, over the course of an entire century. It was a legacy that seemed untouchable. But somewhere along the way, something inside Boeing started to change. The company that had been built by engineers began to be run by businessmen. The focus slowly shifted. The bottom line began to compete with the blueprint. This change was subtle at first, a quiet shift in priorities that was not immediately obvious to the outside world. The monumental merger with its rival, McDonnell Douglas, in 1997, is often cited as a turning point. A new corporate culture began to seep into the halls of Boeing. It was a culture that prized stock prices and quarterly earnings reports as much as, if not more than, engineering perfection. The pressure from Wall Street grew intense. Investors demanded constant growth and higher profits. At the same time, a formidable competitor emerged in Europe: Airbus. The rivalry between Boeing and Airbus became a fierce battle for market share. Every order, every deal was a high-stakes contest. This new reality put immense pressure on Boeing's leadership. They needed to produce new planes faster and cheaper to compete. The old way of doing things, slow, methodical, and engineering-focused, seemed too expensive and too time-consuming for this new, fast-paced global market. This pressure trickled down through the company. Engineers who once had the final say found their concerns being overruled by managers focused on budgets and deadlines. The culture of open debate and rigorous testing began to erode. Some insiders felt that the company was taking shortcuts. They worried that the relentless focus on cost-cutting was compromising the quality and safety that had defined Boeing for a century. The balance of power had shifted. The voice of the engineer was becoming quieter, while the voice of the accountant grew louder and more insistent. This was the environment in which the Boeing 737 MAX was born. It was not conceived as a revolutionary new plane. It was designed as a quick and cheap answer to an Airbus success. The company needed to defend its share of the lucrative single-aisle market. The decision was made to update the existing 737 airframe, a design that dated back to the 1960s, rather than design a new plane from scratch. This decision set in motion a chain of events that would have devastating consequences. It was a choice born of market pressure, not engineering ambition, and it would ultimately lead to the darkest chapter in Boeing's proud history. The year 1997 marked a seismic shift for Boeing. It was the year the company merged with its longtime rival, McDonnell Douglas. On the surface, it looked like a victory. Boeing, the commercial giant, had absorbed its struggling competitor. This created an American aerospace behemoth, a single company with unrivaled dominance in both commercial and defense markets. The deal was celebrated in boardrooms and on Wall Street as a brilliant strategic move. It promised greater efficiency and a stronger competitive position against the rising threat from Europe's Airbus. But inside Boeing, a deep sense of unease began to spread among the engineers and longtime employees. Many at Boeing felt that the company had been invaded, not enlarged. The corporate culture of McDonnell Douglas was starkly different. It was a company known for its aggressive cost-cutting executives and a top-down management style. While Boeing had long been a company run by engineers who prioritized innovation and safety, McDonnell Douglas was driven by financiers who worshipped the bottom line. The new leadership that came over from McDonnell Douglas, including CEO Harry Stonecipher, brought this different philosophy with them. They saw Boeing not as a cradle of engineering marvels, but as an asset that needed to be managed for maximum financial return. This new leadership began to systematically dismantle the old Boeing culture. The idea that engineers should have the final say on product decisions was seen as old-fashioned and inefficient. Instead, decision-making power was centralized among executives who were more attuned to shareholder demands than to the laws of physics. The long-term view, which had allowed for decades of patient research and development, was replaced by a relentless focus on short-term profits. Suddenly, the language heard in the hallways was less about aerodynamics and structural integrity, and more about cost savings, production targets, and stock performance. It was a profound and unsettling change. The famous line, often repeated by veteran Boeing employees, was that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. It captured the feeling that the smaller, financially focused company had somehow conquered the larger, engineering-driven one. The spirit of William Boeing, which had guided the company for 80 years, was being pushed aside. The promise of safety and quality, once the unshakable foundation of the company, now had to compete with the urgent demands of Wall Street. This merger was not just a business transaction, it was the beginning of a battle for the very soul of Boeing. Under the new management, a new gospel took hold at Boeing shareholder value. This was the idea that a company's primary and maybe even its only responsibility was to increase the wealth of its shareholders. Every decision, from the factory floor to the executive suite, was now measured against a single metric: its impact on the stock price. This philosophy was championed by Harry Stonecipher and his successor, James McNerney, who came from General Electric, another company famous for its focus on financial performance. They believed that by relentlessly cutting costs and maximizing profits, they were making Boeing a stronger, more disciplined company for the modern era. To achieve this, the company headquarters was moved from Seattle, the heart of its engineering and manufacturing base, to Chicago in 2001. The move was highly symbolic. It physically separated the corporate leadership from the engineers and mechanics who actually designed and built the airplanes. Executives were no longer a short walk away from the factory floor where they could see the planes taking shape. Instead, they were isolated in a downtown skyscraper, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial reports. This distance created a disconnect between the people making the financial decisions and the people dealing with the engineering realities. The focus on cost-cutting became, honestly, an obsession. The company began to outsource more and more of its production to suppliers around the world. This was done to lower labor costs and reduce Boeing's own financial risk. And while it looked good on paper, it created a complex and fragmented supply chain that was difficult to manage. The company also put immense pressure on its own employees to do more with less. Budgets for research and development were scrutinized. Engineers were told to find cheaper materials and faster production methods. The message was clear: save money at every possible turn, because every dollar saved was a dollar earned for the shareholders. This relentless drive for profit changed the employee-company relationship. In the past, Boeing was known for its lifetime employment and deep loyalty. Now layoffs became a common tool to manage costs. Employee benefits were cut. The sense of being part of a shared mission, a family dedicated to building the world's best airplanes, began to fade. It was replaced by a more transactional relationship, where employees felt like cogs in a machine designed to generate profit. This erosion of morale had a hidden cost. It weakened the culture of vigilance and personal responsibility that is so critical to aviation safety. The clash between the old and new Boeing cultures played out every day in the company's design centers and factories. On one side were the veteran engineers, who had spent their careers steeped in a tradition of meticulous design and exhaustive testing. They believed that safety could not be compromised, and that building a great airplane was an art form that required patience and resources. They were used to a collaborative environment where problems were openly discussed and solved through rigorous engineering debate. For them, the integrity of the aircraft was paramount, and they felt a personal stake in the safety of every plane that bore the Boeing name. On the other side were the new managers, many from the McDonnell Douglas or GE traditions. They brought a different set of priorities. They were focused on schedules, budgets, and market share. From their perspective, the engineers were often too cautious, too slow, and too expensive. They saw the engineering process not as a creative endeavor, but as a cost center that needed to be controlled. They introduced new metrics and processes designed to speed up development and reduce expenses. When engineers raised concerns about potential issues, they were sometimes seen as obstacles to progress rather than as crucial guardians of safety. This conflict created a toxic environment of mistrust. Engineers felt that their professional judgment was being questioned and undermined. They complained that managers without technical backgrounds were making critical decisions about aircraft design. Stories began to circulate of engineers being pressured to approve designs they were not comfortable with, or to sign off on analyses based on incomplete data. The open dialogue that had once been a hallmark of Boeing's process was replaced by a more guarded and fearful atmosphere. People became hesitant to speak up, fearing that raising a red flag would brand them as not a team player and damage their careers. The balance of power had decisively shifted. In the old Boeing, if an engineer said a part was not ready or a design was not safe, the assembly line would stop. That engineer's word was law. In the new Boeing, that same engineer would likely be asked to justify the cost of the delay. They would be challenged by a manager who was under pressure to meet a production quota. This fundamental change meant that financial considerations were now on equal, if not superior footing with engineering imperatives. It was a dangerous trade-off, one that slowly chipped away at the layers of safety that had been built into the company's DNA over decades. Long before the 737 MAX tragedies, there were clear warning signs that Boeing's changing culture was creating risks. One of the most significant examples was the development of the 787 Dreamliner. This was supposed to be a revolutionary new aircraft, built with lightweight composite materials and a groundbreaking electrical system. It was also a test case for Boeing's new business model of aggressive outsourcing. The company farmed out the design and manufacture of major sections of the plane to dozens of partners around the globe. Boeing intended to act as a final assembler, hoping to build the plane faster and with less of its own capital. The Dreamliner program quickly turned into a production nightmare. The global supply chain was a mess. Parts from different suppliers didn't fit together correctly. Quality control was a constant struggle. The program fell years behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget. The extensive use of new, unproven technologies also led to serious safety concerns. Most notably, the plane's lithium-ion batteries were prone to overheating and catching fire, a terrifying prospect on an airplane. The entire 787 fleet had to be grounded in 2013 until a fix could be designed, a major embarrassment for the company. The problems with the 787 should have been a wake-up call. They were a clear demonstration of the dangers of prioritizing speed and cost over sound engineering and quality control. The experience showed that breaking up the design and manufacturing process among so many different partners created new and unforeseen risks. It also revealed a culture where problems were downplayed or hidden until they became full-blown crises. Whistleblowers from the 787 program later described a chaotic environment where they were pressured to ignore manufacturing flaws just to keep the assembly line moving. These were ominous signs of a system under strain. Despite these clear warnings, the lessons from the 787 were not learned. The company's leadership did not see the program's troubles as a symptom of a sick corporate culture. Instead, they viewed them as manageable problems on the path to a profitable new product. The pressure from Wall Street and the intense competition with Airbus did not let up. If anything, it grew stronger. Boeing was desperate to avoid another costly and time-consuming new aircraft program. This set the stage perfectly for the decision to update the old 737 instead of designing a new plane from scratch. A fateful choice that would apply the same flawed cultural philosophy to its most popular airplane. The race for the single-aisle jet market was heating up. This was the most profitable segment of the entire aviation industry. These smaller jets like the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320 were the workhorses of airlines around the world. They flew the majority of domestic and short-haul international routes. For decades, Boeing 737 had been the undisputed king of this market. It was the best-selling commercial jetliner in history, but by 2010, Airbus was closing the gap. Its A320 family was modern, efficient, and increasingly popular with airlines. Boeing executives watched their rival's success with growing anxiety, knowing that losing dominance here would be a devastating blow to the company. The tipping point came in 2010. Airbus announced a major upgrade to its A320. It was called the A320neo, which stood for New Engine Option. By fitting the plane with larger, more fuel-efficient engines, Airbus promised airlines a stunning 15% reduction in fuel costs. This was a massive advantage. Fuel is one of the biggest expenses for any airline. The A320neo was an instant sensation. Orders began pouring in from carriers eager to save money. The pressure on Boeing became immense. The company had been considering designing a brand new clean-sheet aircraft to replace the aging 737, but that would take a decade and tens of billions of dollars. Then came the moment that sent a shockwave through Boeing's Chicago headquarters. In 2011, American Airlines, a loyal Boeing customer for decades, announced a massive order. It was splitting its purchase between the Airbus A320neo and whatever Boeing could offer as a competitor. This was a major betrayal in Boeing's eyes. It signaled that even their most faithful partners were ready to jump ship for the superior efficiency of the Airbus jet. The threat was no longer distant, it was immediate and existential. Boeing's leadership knew they had to act fast. They could not afford to spend 10 years developing a new plane while Airbus ran away with the market. The decision was made in a climate of panic. The company's top executives felt they were backed into a corner. They needed an answer to the A320neo, and they needed it yesterday. The long-term, engineering-first approach of the old Boeing was completely abandoned. The new Boeing, driven by market share and stock price, took over. The only priority was to get a competing plane to market as quickly and as cheaply as possible. This frantic, reactive decision-making process set the stage for a series of compromises and shortcuts. The goal was no longer to build the best plane but simply to build one fast enough to stop the bleeding. Faced with the A320neo threat, Boeing chose the path of least resistance. Instead of designing a new airplane from the ground up, they decided to update the existing 737 for a fourth time. The original 737 first flew in 1967. It was a brilliant design for its time, but it was a product of a different era of aviation. The decision to re-engine this old airframe was a massive gamble. It was driven by business, not engineering. The company called the new version the 737 MAX. The name was a marketing masterstroke. It sounded new, powerful, and advanced, but underneath it was still based on a 50-year-old design. The primary appeal of this strategy was speed and cost. By calling the MAX an update rather than a new model, Boeing could save billions of dollars in development. More importantly, it could avoid the lengthy and expensive process of a full certification by the Federal Aviation Administration. The company argued that the MAX was so similar to the previous 737 that pilots would not need new, costly training in a flight simulator. This was a critical selling point for airlines. Pilot training is a huge expense, and the promise of a seamless transition made the MAX an easy choice for existing 737 operators. The entire plan hinged on the idea that the MAX was just another 737. This decision put Boeing's engineers in an impossible position. They were asked to fit massive, modern, fuel-efficient engines onto a low-slung airframe that was never designed for them. The original 737 sat much lower to the ground than the Airbus A320. The new engines were so large that they wouldn't fit under the old wings. To solve this, engineers had to move the engines forward and higher up on the wing. It was a clever but deeply problematic workaround. This change fundamentally altered the way the airplane handled in the air. It was no longer the same predictable 737 that pilots knew and loved. The pressure to deliver the MAX on an accelerated timeline was relentless. Managers pushed their teams to meet aggressive deadlines. The corporate culture, already weakened by the focus on cost-cutting, became even more strained. Engineers who raised concerns about the compromises being made were often told to find a way to make it work. The message from the top was clear: do not let engineering problems delay the program or add costs. The shortcut that began as a business strategy was now forcing a series of risky engineering choices, each one pushing the updated plane further away from its original stable design. The decision to mount large new engines on the old 737 airframe created a serious aerodynamic problem. The new placement of the engines changed the plane's center of gravity. During certain maneuvers, particularly when the plane was climbing steeply at low speed, this change caused the nose of the aircraft to pitch up dangerously. In a worst-case scenario, this could lead to an aerodynamic stall. A stall is when the wings lose their ability to generate lift, causing the plane to fall from the sky. For pilots, an uncommanded pitch-up is a serious and alarming event. It was a fundamental flaw baked into the very design of the 737 MAX. Boeing's engineers knew about this problem early in the development process. In a company with a healthy safety culture, such a discovery would have triggered a major re-evaluation. It might have even forced a complete redesign of the wings or fuselage. But the 737 MAX program was not operating in a healthy culture. It was driven by a desperate need to compete with Airbus and a promise to airlines that the plane would require no new simulator training. A major redesign was out of the question. It would have been too slow and too expensive. The program would have failed its primary business objectives. So, instead of a physical, hardware-based solution, Boeing's leaders opted for a software fix. They decided to create a program that would work in the background, automatically pushing the plane's nose down if it sensed it was pitching up too steeply. This system would, in theory, make the MAX feel and fly just like the older 737s. It was a patch designed to mask a fundamental aerodynamic instability. This decision was a critical turning point. The company was choosing to use hidden software to correct a physical flaw in the aircraft, a solution that placed immense trust in lines of code to keep the plane safe. This software patch was given an innocuous name, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. The design of MCAS itself was fraught with compromises. To keep things simple and avoid extra scrutiny from regulators, the system was designed to rely on a single sensor. This meant that if that one sensor failed or provided a bad reading, MCAS would have faulty information. There was no backup. This was a violation of a core principle of aviation design, which calls for redundancy in all critical systems. It was a shortcut on top of a shortcut, a decision that would have unimaginably tragic consequences. MCAS was Boeing's secret weapon to solve its self-inflicted engineering problem, but it was also a secret that the company kept from almost everyone. Boeing made a deliberate choice to downplay the existence and power of this new system. Why? Because acknowledging MCAS would have undermined their entire sales pitch. If regulators and airlines knew that a powerful new software system was needed to make the plane fly properly, they would almost certainly have demanded that pilots receive new training in a flight simulator. This would have erased the MAX's key competitive advantage over the Airbus A320neo and added huge costs for airline customers. The company's goal was to make MCAS invisible. In the official pilot manuals for the 737 MAX, the system was barely mentioned. It was described in a short technical glossary, but there was no explanation of what it did or how it could take control of the aircraft. Most pilots who transitioned to the MAX had no idea it even existed. They were told the plane was essentially the same as the one they had been flying for years. They were given a short course on an iPad, which focused on the new cockpit displays, and were sent on their way. They were completely unaware of the powerful software that could automatically push the nose of their plane toward the ground. This secrecy extended to the regulators at the FAA. Boeing provided limited information about MCAS to the agency. They portrayed it as a minor modification to an existing system, not a brand new flight-critical piece of software. At the time, the FAA was increasingly delegating its oversight responsibilities back to the manufacturers themselves. Boeing's own employees were authorized to act on behalf of the FAA to certify the safety of their own company's designs. This created a clear conflict of interest. The very people tasked with ensuring the plane was safe were also under immense pressure from their managers to get it approved quickly and without costly changes. Inside Boeing, some engineers were deeply troubled. They knew that MCAS was far more aggressive and powerful than what they had initially described to the FAA. They knew it relied on a single, non-redundant sensor. But the culture of fear and the pressure to stay on schedule silenced many potential dissenters. Raising a major safety concern at this late stage would have been a career-ending move for many. The system was approved, the planes were built, and they were delivered to airlines with a hidden, powerful, and deeply flawed piece of software that their pilots knew nothing about. The trap had been set. With the engineering shortcuts hidden behind a wall of software and secrecy, Boeing's sales team went on the offensive. They marketed the 737 MAX aggressively, emphasizing its fuel efficiency, and most importantly, the minimal training required. They presented the airplane to the world not as a compromised design, but as the latest and greatest version of a trusted classic. The marketing materials were slick, the promises were bold, and the orders flooded in. Airlines eager to cut costs and compete were thrilled with the proposition. Boeing was back in the game against Airbus, and its stock price soared. On the surface, the MAX strategy was a spectacular success. The promise of no new simulator training was the cornerstone of the entire sales campaign. It was more than just a selling point. It was a contractual guarantee. Boeing even offered one of its key customers, Southwest Airlines, a rebate of $1 million per airplane if regulators ever determined that simulator training was in fact necessary. This shows how confident or how desperate the company was to maintain the fiction that the MAX was just like its predecessor. They were literally betting the company's money that their secret software fix would remain just that, a secret. This put enormous pressure on Boeing to ensure that nothing about MCAS would ever alarm pilots or regulators. This sales strategy represented a profound betrayal of trust. For a century, pilots had trusted Boeing to build planes that were honest and transparent in their design. They believed that if a system was critical to flight, they would be trained on it. Boeing shattered that trust. The company made a calculated decision that it was better to deceive pilots than to admit the MAX had a fundamental handling problem. They prioritized sales targets and delivery schedules over the sacred principle of informing the flight crew about the systems on their own aircraft. It was a lie of omission, and it was a lie that was sold to hundreds of airlines around the globe. As the first 737 MAX jets rolled off the assembly line and into service in 2017, the company celebrated. The executives in Chicago saw a crisis averted and a competitor held at bay. The shareholders were rewarded with a rising stock price. But on the flight decks of these new planes, pilots were flying blind. They were operating a machine with a powerful hidden system they did not understand. a system that was designed with a fatal flaw. The company's relentless race to beat Airbus had succeeded in the short term, but it had planted the seeds of a disaster that was now waiting to happen. On October 29, 2018, the illusion of the 737 MAX's success shattered. Lion Air Flight 610, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, on a routine morning flight. On board were 189 people, including passengers and crew, full of the normal expectations of a safe and uneventful journey. The plane was practically factory fresh. It had only been in service for 2 months. But just minutes after lifting off into the warm tropical sky, something went terribly wrong. The pilots began to struggle with the aircraft. The plane's nose repeatedly pushed itself downward, forcing them into a desperate battle to keep the jet climbing. It was a fight they were not equipped to win, against an opponent they didn't know existed. The pilots, Bhavya Suneja and his co-pilot Harvino, were experienced aviators, but they were confronted with a situation that was not in any of their training manuals. Their instruments were giving them conflicting information, and indicators showed they were in danger of stalling, even though their airspeed was normal. At the same time, the plane's controls fought against them with unrelenting force. They pulled back on the yoke, trying to raise the nose, but an automated system pushed it back down again and again. For 11 terrifying minutes, this struggle continued. The pilots were confused and overwhelmed, unaware that the plane's own software was driving it into a deadly dive. The culprit was MCAS. A single, faulty angle of attack sensor on the outside of the fuselage was feeding bad data to the flight control computer. This sensor incorrectly told MCAS that the plane's nose was pitched dangerously high. Following its flawed programming, MCAS activated automatically. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It pushed the nose down to prevent a stall that wasn't actually happening. The pilots, unaware of MCAS, had no idea why their plane was behaving so erratically. They were fighting a ghost in the machine, a secret system that was now overriding their every command and pushing them toward the sea below. 13 minutes after takeoff, the struggle ended. Lion Air Flight 610 plunged into the Java Sea at a tremendous speed, disintegrating on impact. There were no survivors. The news sent a shockwave through the aviation world. A brand new airplane from a world-class manufacturer does not simply fall out of the sky. In the immediate aftermath, there was confusion. Early speculation focused on pilot error or maintenance issues at the airline. But for those inside Boeing who knew the secrets of the MAX, a dreadful realization must have begun to dawn. The shortcut they had taken, the software patch they had hidden, had just led to a catastrophe. The black box flight recorders recovered from the wreckage of Lion Air 610 told a chilling story. They revealed the frantic, desperate final minutes on the flight deck. The data showed that MCAS had activated more than 24 times. Each time, the pilots would counter it, pulling the plane's nose back up. But just a few seconds later, the system would re-engage, pushing the nose down again with even more force. It was a relentless, exhausting cycle. The pilots were manually flying the plane, trying to overcome a powerful force they could not identify. They ran through checklists, trying to diagnose what was happening, but nothing in their procedures mentioned a system like MCAS. The design of MCAS was honestly tragically flawed in several ways. Not only did it rely on a single sensor, but it was also far more powerful than Boeing had initially intended. Early in the design phase, engineers had increased the system's authority, allowing it to move the plane's horizontal stabilizer much more aggressively. This change was never fully communicated to the FAA or to the pilots. So when the faulty sensor triggered the system on the Lion Air flight, it wasn't a gentle nudge, it was a powerful, unrelenting command that was difficult for the pilots to overcome physically. They were fighting against the full force of the plane's flight control system. There was a procedure to disable a system like this, known as the runaway stabilizer trim checklist. It involved flipping 2 cutout switches on the center console. This would have cut power to the entire stabilizer trim system, including MCAS. In fact, on a flight the day before the crash, a different crew on the same aircraft had experienced a similar problem and had successfully used this procedure to save the plane. However, they did not fully report the terrifying nature of the incident, and the maintenance crew did not identify the root cause. For the crew of Flight 610, under immense stress and confusion, they did not recognize the problem in time to perform the correct actions. The very premise of the 737 MAX program, that it was just another 737, had created this deadly trap. Because pilots were told the plane was the same, they were not trained for the ways it was different. They were not taught about MCS, how to recognize its activation, or how it could be triggered by a single faulty sensor. Boeing had made a deliberate decision to withhold this information to save time and money. That decision left the pilots of Lion Air 610 in the dark, fighting for their lives against a system they knew nothing about, a battle that was almost impossible for them to win. In the aftermath of the Lion Air crash, Boeing's response was guarded and defensive. The company issued a bulletin to all 737 MAX operators, reminding them of the existing procedure for dealing with a runaway stabilizer. But the bulletin was criticized for what it left out. It failed to mention MCS by name and did not explain that this new system was the reason the stabilizer might run away in the first place. Boeing was still trying to control the narrative, to frame the problem as a failure to follow procedures rather than a fundamental design flaw. The company's priority seemed to be protecting the MAX program, not grounding the fleet to ensure safety. This response stunned pilot unions and aviation safety experts around the world. They were outraged to learn, only after a fatal crash, about a hidden flight control system on their airplanes. The American Airlines Pilots Union confronted Boeing executives in a tense meeting. They demanded to know why they hadn't been told about MCAS. The Boeing officials were defensive, insisting that the system operated in the background and that the existing checklists were sufficient. The pilots were furious. They argued that knowing about the system and understanding how it worked was critical to being able to diagnose the problem correctly under pressure. The trust between Boeing and its pilots was beginning to crumble. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, also came under scrutiny. Why had they certified a plane with such a dangerous system? Investigations would later reveal that the FAA's own analysis of MCAS was flawed. The agency had delegated much of the safety assessment to Boeing itself. Boeing, in turn, had provided the FAA with an analysis that downplayed the risks. It incorrectly assumed that pilots would react to an MCAS failure within 3 seconds, an unrealistic expectation for a confusing and unexpected event. The regulator, which was supposed to be the public's watchdog, had been too trusting and too close to the company it was supposed to oversee. Despite the crash and the growing chorus of concern from pilots, neither Boeing nor the FAA grounded the 737 MAX fleet. They believed that issuing the bulletin was enough to ensure safety. They calculated that the odds of another crash happening before a permanent software fix could be developed were astronomically low. It was a terrible miscalculation. They were betting that lightning wouldn't strike twice. They left hundreds of 737 MAX jets flying, each one with the same flawed software, the same vulnerability to a single sensor failure. The world was assured that the plane was safe, even as the clock was ticking toward another disaster. Less than 5 months after the Lion Air tragedy, the world's worst fears were realized. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 prepared for takeoff from Addis Ababa. It was another brand-new Boeing 737 MAX 8, carrying 157 people from 35 different countries. The flight crew, led by Captain Yared Getachew, was well regarded and had received the recent bulletin from Boeing about the MAX. They were aware of the potential for a problem, but awareness alone is not a substitute for proper training or a safe design. As the plane climbed into the sky, the same nightmare that had doomed Lion Air 610 began to unfold once again. Immediately after takeoff, a faulty angle of attack sensor failed, just as it had on the Lion Air flight. MCAS kicked in just as it had before. The system, fed erroneous data, began pushing the airplane's nose down. The pilots of Flight 302 fought back bravely. They remembered their training and the recent bulletin. They correctly identified the problem as a runaway stabilizer and performed the checklist. They flipped the cutout switches, which should have disabled the system. For a moment it seemed to work. They had disengaged the electronic trim system and were now trying to manually turn a large trim wheel to bring the nose back up. Here, a second cruel design flaw revealed itself. Because MCAS had pushed the nose down so aggressively, the plane was flying at an extremely high speed. The aerodynamic forces on the horizontal stabilizer were immense. This made it physically impossible for the pilots to turn the manual trim wheel. The wheel was essentially frozen in place. Trapped in a high-speed dive and unable to manually correct the trim, the pilots made a fateful decision. They re-engaged the electronic system, likely hoping to use its power to help them regain control. The moment they did, MCAS, still receiving bad data, activated one last time, sending the plane into its final fatal plunge. The flight lasted just 6 minutes. The plane crashed into the ground at a near vertical angle, leaving a deep crater and a scene of utter devastation. There were no survivors. This second crash was a brutal and undeniable indictment of the Boeing 737 MAX. It was no longer possible to blame a single airline's maintenance or a single crew's response. Two different crews on two different continents had been confronted with the same design flaw. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The software patch created in a panic to beat Airbus had now claimed 346 lives. The shortcut had led to a dead end. The crash of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 was, honestly, the final straw. What had started as a regional tragedy in Indonesia was now, without a doubt, an undeniable global crisis. The world's trust in Boeing, and in the American aviation regulators who had certified the plane, just evaporated, practically overnight. Within hours of the crash, China became the first country to ground the 737 MAX. It was a stunning move, and honestly, a direct challenge to the authority of the FAA, which was still insisting the plane was safe to fly. One by one, other nations followed China's lead. Aviation authorities in Singapore, the United Kingdom, and across Europe issued their own orders, banning the MAX from their airspace. The pressure on the FAA became, well, just unbearable. For 2 days, the United States stood as an outlier, a lonely island where the 737 MAX was still permitted to fly. The agency seemed paralyzed, unwilling to admit that its own certification process had failed so catastrophically. The image was terrible. While the rest of the world was putting passenger safety first, the American regulator appeared to be protecting the interests of its flagship manufacturer. The flying public was scared and angry. Passengers began refusing to board MAX flights, and airlines faced a logistical nightmare with a global fleet of planes that nobody trusted. Finally, on March 13, 2019, the FAA buckled. Citing new satellite data that showed a clear similarity between the flight paths of the two crashed jets, the agency announced it was grounding the entire U.S. fleet of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. The decision was honestly long overdue. For the first time in decades, the global aviation community had lost faith in the FAA's judgment. The grounding marked the beginning of the darkest period in Boeing's history. Hundreds of its best-selling planes were now parked on tarmacs around the world, symbols not of American pride, but of corporate greed and broken trust. The crashes and the subsequent grounding triggered a cascade of consequences. Investigations were launched by Congress, the Department of Justice, and international bodies. The families of the 346 victims began a painful and powerful quest for answers and accountability. The story of MCAS, the secret software, and the shortcuts taken to rush the MAX to market started to emerge into the public eye. The dark truth of what had happened inside Boeing was no longer a secret known only to a few engineers and executives. It was now a global scandal, and the world was demanding to know how a company once synonymous with safety had gone so horribly wrong. With the 737 MAX fleet grounded worldwide, a new and crucial set of voices began to emerge from the shadows. The whistleblowers. These were current and former Boeing employees who had witnessed the cultural decay firsthand. They had tried to raise alarms from within the company, only to be ignored, sidelined, or even punished for their integrity. One of the most prominent was Ed Pearson, a former senior manager at the 737 factory in Renton, Washington. He had seen the chaotic production environment in the months leading up to the first crash. He described a factory floor under extreme pressure to produce planes at an unsustainable rate, leading to exhausted workers and numerous quality control issues that were simply overlooked. Pearson's story was a damning indictment of the profits over safety culture that had taken root. He sent emails to Boeing executives, including the head of the 737 program, pleading with them to shut down the production line to address the serious problems he was witnessing. He warned that he was seeing workers making mistakes out of sheer fatigue, and that he feared a catastrophic event was inevitable. His concerns were dismissed. The pressure to meet production targets for the best-selling MAX was simply too intense. Management's response was to continue pushing forward, prioritizing schedule and financial goals above the fundamental safety warnings coming from their own experienced staff. After the Lion Air crash, Pearson felt a sickening sense of dread, convinced that the production issues he had flagged were a contributing factor. He tried again to get Boeing's leadership to listen, but to no avail. After the second crash in Ethiopia, he could no longer stay silent. He went to the FAA, to Congress, and eventually to the public with his story. His testimony, along with that of other whistleblowers, painted a picture of a company that had lost its way. They described a system where managers openly ridiculed employees who raised safety concerns, and where the fear of retaliation created a powerful culture of silence, allowing dangerous practices to continue unchecked. Another engineer, Curtis Eubank, filed an internal ethics complaint after the crashes. He revealed that early in the MAX development he had proposed adding a synthetic airspeed system, a more robust backup system that could have helped prevent the MCAS failures. His proposal was rejected by management because it would have added cost and potentially triggered the need for new pilot training. These inside accounts were devastating. They provided concrete evidence that Boeing's leadership had been repeatedly warned about specific risks and had made conscious decisions to prioritize profit over safety, directly contributing to the chain of events that led to the deaths of 346 people. The pilots who flew the 737 MAX felt a profound sense of betrayal. They had been kept in the dark about a critical flight control system on their own aircraft. The trust they had placed in Boeing for generations was just shattered. Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger, famous for the Miracle on the Hudson, became a powerful voice for his profession. He testified before Congress that he and his co-pilot had experienced a similar sensor failure in their Airbus A320. But because of robust system design and proper training, they were able to handle it. He argued that the MAX pilots were denied that same opportunity because Boeing had hidden MCAS from them, a decision he called a fatal and unforgivable error. This anger was echoed in pilot unions across the globe. In a tense and emotional meeting with Boeing executives after the first crash, the pilots from American Airlines did not hold back. Recordings of the meeting revealed their fury. "We flat out deserve to know what is on our airplanes," one pilot said, his voice full of disbelief and frustration. They accused Boeing of deliberately misleading them and questioned how they could ever trust the company again. The executives' attempts to reassure them fell flat as they continued to downplay the significance of MCAS, further eroding the little credibility they had left with the people who actually operated their machines. The core of the pilots' anger was not just about MCAS itself, but what its existence represented. It was proof that Boeing no longer viewed them as essential partners in ensuring safety. In the past, pilots and engineers worked collaboratively to build safe, reliable aircraft. The MAX program revealed a new adversarial relationship, where the manufacturer saw pilots as a cost to be managed. The decision to avoid simulator training was a business calculation that treated pilots' knowledge as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a vital layer of safety. This fundamental disrespect for their role was a bitter pill to swallow for a proud and professional community. As the grounding dragged on, pilots became key stakeholders in determining when and if the MAX would fly again. They refused to be rushed. Pilot unions insisted on being directly involved in testing the new software fix and demanded that mandatory simulator training become the new global standard for all MAX pilots. They were no longer willing to take Boeing's word for anything. They used their collective power to demand transparency and a return to a safety-first culture. The pilots were sending a clear message. They would be the final judges of whether the 737 MAX was truly safe to fly, reclaiming their role as the ultimate guardians of the sky. For the families of the 346 victims, the grounding of the 737 MAX was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. They were thrust into a global spotlight, transformed from ordinary people into powerful advocates for aviation safety. United by their shared grief, they organized, forming a powerful coalition that transcended national borders. Their mission was twofold: to find out the truth of how their loved ones died, and to hold Boeing and its leaders accountable. They refused to let the crashes be dismissed as mere accidents or statistics. They traveled to Washington, D.C., carrying photos of their lost family members, ensuring that lawmakers saw the human cost of corporate negligence. Their voices brought an essential human element to a story that could have otherwise been dominated by technical details and corporate jargon. Michael Stumo, whose daughter Samya died on the Ethiopian Airlines flight, became a prominent and articulate critic of Boeing and the FAA. He and other family members attended congressional hearings, staring directly at the Boeing executives and regulators who testified. Their silent, powerful presence in the hearing rooms was a constant reminder of what was at stake. They demanded answers to difficult questions, challenging the carefully crafted statements from the company, and pushing for genuine accountability rather than empty apologies. The family's quest for justice was not just about emotion, it was about facts. They hired lawyers and investigators to uncover the truth, pushing for the release of internal Boeing documents. Their legal efforts helped expose the culture of concealment within the company. Emails and instant messages from Boeing employees were made public, revealing a shocking level of cynicism and a disturbing awareness of the MAX's flaws. One employee wrote that the airplane was, quote, designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. Another bragged about Jedi mind-tricking regulators into accepting the plane with minimal scrutiny. These revelations were heartbreaking for the families, but they validated their fight for the truth. Through their tireless advocacy, the families of the victims of Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian Airlines 302 fundamentally changed the conversation around the 737 MAX crisis. They ensured that the focus remained on safety and accountability. They successfully lobbied for legislative changes to strengthen FAA oversight and protect whistleblowers. Their efforts meant that Boeing could not simply issue a software fix and move on. They forced a global reckoning, demanding systemic changes to ensure that no other families would have to endure the same preventable tragedy. Their legacy is not just one of loss, but of a powerful, successful fight for safer skies for everyone. The twin crashes of the 737 MAX placed the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, under the most intense scrutiny in its history. For decades, the FAA had been considered the gold standard of aviation safety regulators around the world. Other countries often followed its lead, trusting its rigorous processes and technical expertise. But the MAX crisis shattered that reputation. The fact that the rest of the world grounded the plane before the FAA did was a stunning vote of no confidence. It exposed the American regulator as being slow to act and honestly, seemingly more concerned with protecting a domestic corporation than with protecting the flying public. This hesitation caused irreparable damage to its global standing. Investigations by Congress and the Department of Transportation's Inspector General revealed a deeply flawed certification process. The inquiry focused on a program that allowed Boeing to act on the FAA's behalf, certifying its own aircraft. This practice of delegation had been expanding for years, a result of budget cuts at the FAA and the increasing complexity of modern aircraft. In the case of the 737 MAX, this created a massive conflict of interest. Boeing employees, who were supposed to be acting as objective safety inspectors, were under immense pressure from their own managers to approve designs quickly and keep costs down. A system, really, that was just ripe for abuse. The investigation uncovered specific instances where the FAA failed in its oversight duties. It was revealed that FAA managers had overruled the concerns of their own technical experts who had questioned aspects of the MCAS design. The agency accepted Boeing's safety analysis of the system, an analysis that was later found to be deeply flawed and based on unrealistic assumptions about pilot reaction times. The regulator that was supposed to be the public's watchdog had become, in the eyes of many critics, a lapdog for the industry it was meant to police. The trust between the FAA and the public, as well as with international regulators, was broken. In the wake of the crisis, calls for reform were loud and clear. Congress passed new legislation aimed at strengthening the FAA's oversight capabilities and ensuring its independence from the manufacturers. The law requires the FAA to approve key safety features directly, rather than delegating the task. It also provides greater protection for whistleblowers within manufacturing companies. The 737 MAX scandal forced the FAA into a period of deep self-reflection. The agency had to not only recertify the troubled aircraft, but also rebuild its own credibility on the world stage, a long and difficult process of proving that it had learned the hard lessons from this catastrophic failure of its core mission. The story of the Boeing 737 MAX is more than just a tale of two tragic plane crashes. It is, honestly, a cautionary lesson about the dangers of a corporate culture that loses its way. Boeing, once a paragon of engineering excellence, became a company fixated on financial metrics. The relentless pressure to boost shareholder value, cut costs, and beat its rival Airbus created an environment where safety was no longer the top priority. This cultural decay, which began with the McDonnell-Douglas merger and accelerated under a new generation of leadership, set the stage for disaster. The company forgot the simple truth that had made it great. Its most valuable asset was not its stock price, but the unwavering trust of the people who built, flew, and traveled on its planes. The crisis teaches us that small compromises made over time can lead to catastrophic failure. The decision to take a shortcut by updating a 50-year-old airframe was the first step down a dangerous path. This led to the engineering problem of the oversized engines, which in turn led to the secret software fix, MCAS. That software was then designed with a fatal flaw, reliance on a single sensor, to avoid further costs and regulatory scrutiny. Each decision, perhaps viewed in isolation, seemed justifiable to managers focused on deadlines and budgets, but together, they formed a chain of errors that removed layer after layer of safety, leaving pilots and passengers tragically vulnerable to a single point of failure. Furthermore, the Boeing saga highlights the critical importance of transparency and an environment where dissent is encouraged, not punished. The company deliberately hid the existence of MCAS from pilots, the very people who were the last line of defense. Inside the company, engineers who raised concerns were silenced or ignored. This culture of fear and concealment is toxic in any organization, but in aviation, it is deadly. A healthy safety culture depends on open communication, where problems are brought to light and solved, not hidden to meet a schedule. The voices of whistleblowers like Ed Pearson and Curtis Eubank were not heroic anomalies. They should have been a routine part of a healthy engineering process. Ultimately, the 737 MAX story is a stark reminder that human lives are at stake in the decisions made in corporate boardrooms. The focus on quarterly earnings and market share led directly to the deaths of 346 people. The families of the victims of Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian Airlines 302 have paid the ultimate price for Boeing's failures. Their powerful advocacy forced the world to see the human cost behind the headlines and financial reports. Their quest for justice ensures that the lessons from this tragedy are not forgotten. They have taught us that accountability must extend to the very top of a corporation when its choices lead to such devastating consequences. For Boeing to truly recover, it must do more than just fix the 737 MAX's software and get the planes flying again. The company needs a fundamental, top-to-bottom cultural transformation. It must return to the values that once made it great. This means empowering its engineers and listening to their expertise. It means re-establishing safety as the single most important priority, above all financial considerations. The leadership in Chicago must reconnect with the factory floors in Seattle, closing the gap that allowed management to become so detached from the realities of building airplanes. True recovery will be measured not in aircraft deliveries, but in the rebuilding of trust with its employees, its customers, and the flying public. The crisis also serves as a crucial wake-up call for the entire aviation industry and its regulators. The FAA's failure to properly oversee Boeing exposed the weaknesses of a system that allowed too much self-certification. Regulators must be independent, well-funded, and empowered to act as true watchdogs for the public, not as partners to the corporations they regulate. The global grounding of the MAX demonstrated that international cooperation is vital, but it also showed that every country must maintain its own rigorous standards. The era of blindly following the FAA's lead is over. A more skeptical and collaborative global approach to certification will create new layers of oversight and make the skies safer for everyone. For those of us who fly, this story changes how we look at the industry. It reminds us that safety is not guaranteed. It is the result of a complex system of design, manufacturing, maintenance, and regulation that requires constant vigilance. As passengers, we must demand transparency and accountability from both manufacturers and airlines. The incredible safety record of modern aviation was built over decades, but the Boeing crisis shows how quickly it can be compromised when priorities shift. We now understand that the culture within a company like Boeing has a direct impact on our own well-being every time we step onto a plane. The dark truth of Boeing is a somber chapter in aviation history, but it does not have to be the final word. It can and must be a catalyst for meaningful change. By learning from these failures, Boeing has the opportunity to redeem itself and once again become a symbol of innovation and safety. The industry has a chance to strengthen its defenses against corporate greed and complacency. If these lessons are truly taken to heart, the legacy of the 346 people who lost their lives will be a new era of aviation. One that is stronger, more transparent, and more committed than ever to the sacred trust of protecting every single passenger.